Good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for registering for this webinar. I think this is a really important webinar. I wanted to first do some introductions, and then we will dive right on into session one. Now, my name is Jennifer Furlong, and I'm the Director of Communications and an Analyst Manager for Ad Fontes Media. And I'm joined by Beth Heldebrandt, who is our Media Research Specialist, and Aaron Fox Ramirez, who is our Director of Research and Ratings. So I'm going to ask them to monitor the Q&A. If you do have questions throughout the seminar, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A, and we're going to hope to leave plenty of time at the end to answer all the questions that you have. So what are we here tonight for? We are holding this webinar, Teaching News Literacy in the Era of Hyper-Polarized Media. I think we can all agree that this is a very important topic. Media literacy is at the top of many school systems, what they want to achieve, in their curriculum. And so we think this is going to be a really useful webinar for you. So what do we have on the agenda for everyone? We do have this broken into 3 sessions. And so tonight is really going to be the introduction to Ad Fontes, what is our why, and then I want to introduce you to our tools, the media bias chart. And then we're going to really focus on our methodology. And the first part of our methodology I want to introduce you to is the reliability aspect of our methodology. And then next week, we will continue with the methodology, but look at the bias part of it. And then I want us to do some practical application so that we can look at some real examples and how you might pull these real examples into your classrooms and then use the media bias chart and some of our other resources in the classroom to be able to have a good discussion about news literacy with your students. And then the final week, session 3, we'll do a quick recap of everything that we talked about during sessions 1 and 2. Again, go over some of the tools that you can use to implement everything that we have talked about in the seminars, and then wrap it up with a final Q&A. And also, we'll talk about certification. So if you want us to provide a certificate of attendance so that you can use it for your continuing education units, then we'll show you how you can do that as well, who to contact in order to get that certificate. So we have a lot to go over. You are getting the Cliff Notes version of what it is that the analysts go through whenever we do our training to implement the methodology, when we are looking to analyze certain articles or episodes, whether it's a podcast or a TV episode. And so usually our analysts will go through about 35 hours of training a year to be able to keep up to date, because we're always updating the methodology. We want to make sure that is as updated as possible and as robust as possible. So our why, well, Ad Fontes, we really exist because we want to bring people together. And this methodology is a tool that can be used that gives individuals a foundation, a way to be able to discuss the news in a logical way that will help us understand not only the bias that may or may not be present in different articles, but also it gives us a way to determine how reliable we think these articles are. And along with that, we recognize that this is something that is important to teach in the schools, but we recognize that it's also difficult to teach news literacy, especially in the era of hyper-polarized media, but it is needed. we know that there are 18 states that already have legislation in the books requiring media literacy to be taught in the classroom, K through 12. And so we have created lessons. We have a good list of resources that you can use in the classroom in order to help promote those discussions. And we have different levels of those as well. So I'll show you those later on during the presentation so that you can see everything that you have at your disposal if you want to integrate this into your classrooms. And we'll show you how to use the tools so that you can teach it to your children. So why content analysis? This is the methodology that Ad Fontes decided to adopt in order to analyze these articles. Well, content analysis, it's really systematic. It's structured. It is a way to apply analysis consistently, regardless of the content that we are reading. It's observable. It's measurable in terms of we look at the words. It allows us to look at the themes. We look at the sources that are used by the individual articles, and we also look at, how all of this comes together to frame whatever the topic is that's being discussed. And by adopting this methodology, it really helps to reduce the subjectiveness part of the analysis. One of the advantages that many of us who are analysts with Ad Fontes, what we have learned is by adopting this methodology and working with the other analysts, this enables us to be able to have discussions about the articles that we're looking at. Sometimes we don't recognize where our own blind spots are. And so by adopting this methodology, it really helps mitigate our own bias. And it really gives us a strong foundation in order to have discussions about the text itself. Something else that's really useful about content analysis is it allows for replication by other analysts. If you have a rubric, you have an ability to be able to replicate, and apply the methodology consistently to multiple sources across the board. It also allows for us to be able to compare our ratings between analysts. So that also helps increase the validity of the results. So you can say if you can learn how to teach this methodology to your students, then they are going to experience the same benefits that the analysts do at Ad Fontes. At the same time, it generates the quantitative data, that numerical representation that allows for a statistical analysis. We can do comparisons, we can identify patterns, and that's really important when we're analyzing so much data. And that's what helps inform the media bias chart that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And this content analysis, the methodology that we have adopted, it's really comprehensive. It does include multiple elements of the news story. Like I said before, we look at the language that's being used in the story. We look at the headlines that's being used and how does that impact perception. And we also look at the visuals, the pictures that the source chooses to use to complement the story does have an impact on the reader's perception of that story. So we apply this methodology to really large samples of news stories from across the board, and it helps us to identify those patterns and trends, which enables us to do that large-scale analysis and informs the media bias chart. So as you are getting the Cliff Notes version of the content analysis methodology that we use, I want you to think about the discussions that you could have with your students as you think about implementing this methodology in your own classes, and depending on the different topics that you're teaching at the same time. And then save those questions. If questions come up, put those in the Q&A, and then we'll address those toward the end. So what are we really teaching in the classroom? When you use this methodology to teach news literacy, it really does help the students develop their critical thinking. The visual representation makes it easier to understand and compare the positioning of the different sources that exist on the media bias chart. And because it is so visual, it gives your students the opportunity to see each source in relation to each other so that you can do that comparison. In the lessons that we provide, they really do introduce the students to the differences in what is considered fact reporting versus what is considered analysis versus what is considered opinion. And that's really important to be able to read the articles and discern the differences between those. So it does help improve the reading comprehension. And it also helps students gain an understanding of this is a nuanced approach, to media bias and understanding what causes media bias. And it helps them to consider political bias at the same time. Now, they're not going to become political experts. Many of us are not political experts, but the more news that they will read, it will help increase their political knowledge. And so they'll be able to make the connections between what they're reading and then what's happening, in the real world. So altogether, we think this is really valuable, a valuable tool that you can use to teach your students about the importance of methodology. At the end of the day, being able to analyze and implement that analysis and help them to understand that there is a need for evaluation, evaluating all the information that's coming their way so that they can make informed decisions about that information. So this is really what we are teaching. Our analysts are learning this at the same time, and this is something that that would be implemented in your classrooms at the same time. Now, I know sometimes it might be difficult to get the students to buy into this. After all, it's reading the news, or it might be listening to a podcast or watching a television show on the news. And it's not exactly the most exciting things for students all the time, but it is something that we need to help them understand why this is an important skill for them to develop. You don't want to be manipulated. That's one of the things that we want our students to understand. The more that they are able to use this skill to analyze different texts, to analyze the content that they're looking at, the less prone they are to being manipulated, because they will have that discerning eye for the information that's coming their way. And at the end of the day, the quality of the information that they are consuming does affect the quality of their decision making. And in turn, that will affect the quality of their life. And so this is a lifelong skill that we hope that, as they learn to use this skill, they will continue to practice at it. And, the more they practice it, the better they'll get at it. So this is really something that we hope that they will adopt, throughout their lifetime. So it really truly is an important thing for them to be able to learn. Something else that we're going to spend the vast majority of our time tonight looking at the methodology itself. Like I said, we really want to focus on the reliability aspect of our methodology. And I'm sure you are familiar with the media bias chart. This is a blank version of the media bias chart. And this is something that you can actually use in your classroom. This is something that we encourage you to use with your students, because it's something that they can use to plot the different pieces of information that you could have them analyze. And then it would be something that they could use to compare with each other and then to compare with you. And it'll help have that discussion, come about. So The chart really is the starting point for all of the discussions that you can have in the classroom on media bias and on reliability. This is the tool that we use as analysts to facilitate our discussions. We recognize that it's not necessarily the sole determinant of media bias and reliability, but it absolutely is a strong starting point for these discussions. And that's really the value of the media bias chart, is because as we use it to read through different texts, the long-term analysis shows that, things do change over time. And so that is something else that could be useful to your students so that they can see over the long term how these different sources may change over time. That's really valuable for them to understand. And the chart is a useful tool for students because it's visual. It's a really clear visual point that helps the students grasp the concept of media bias and helps them to learn how to evaluate the reliability of the content that they are looking at. And so the chart helps the students recognize that bias, it also exists on a continuum. As you can see the top here, there is that spectrum of bias. And something else, when we look at the reliability, one thing that they will learn as they begin to plot the different sources that they're looking at, just because something is in the middle does not necessarily mean that there is no bias. It could be a representation of, there's multiple viewpoints that are representing different sides of the issue. So it may be a balanced look at whatever the topic is that article is discussing. But with the reliability, just because it doesn't have any bias, that doesn't necessarily equate to it also being very high in reliability. So the idea of having this on a spectrum is very useful to be able to, it's a good catalyst for those discussions in the classroom. And it also is a good tool to have the conversation with your students about different news outlets that they will differ in the terms of their journalistic rigor, in their adherence to fact reporting. They can see that some sources will tend to hover around more analysis and opinion than they do with fact reporting. So this is a useful tool across the board to have all of those different types of conversations with your students. So this is really the start of how we begin to implement the methodology. As we go along and discuss the reliability part of the methodology this evening, I would like for you to have this chart in front of you and really consider where you might place some of the examples. Now, tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but the next session, we're going to bring in some concrete examples. But I think it's really useful for you to get used to our methodology, really look at the chart itself and think about the different news articles that you read, some of the different podcast episodes that you listen to, the different television shows that you watch, and begin practicing how might you plot them on this chart. I think that's going to be really helpful. And then, as we get to the Q&A, that might spark some questions for you as far as the methodology goes, so that we can address that at the end. So let's jump into the reliability aspect of it. Really, what we're looking at is, what kind of news can you most rely on? And so the reliability measures really how much you can rely upon an article or a source to be truthfully, factful, widely accepted, thoroughly vetted, thoroughly informed, new information that is useful. These are the types of questions that we're asking, and how does it affect you? How does it affect our society? So what we do is we look at different categories that we want to rate in order to determine the overall reliability score. And so one of the things that I want to show you as we are looking at the we relate reliability is I want to show you there are some media literacy lessons that go along with this, because the different categories that we look at, the lessons that you can implement in your classrooms go right along with the methodology that I'm talking about this evening. And so you can see here introductory lessons. We have a simplified version. These are about 6 minutes each that you could actually use in your classroom. That'll give a quick introduction to your students, how to rate the methodology, how to rate for reliability, as well as for bias. Again, that's what we'll cover next time. And then we also have, these are the sources that you can use in the classroom. So for example, if we want to look at the category of expression, you would be able to open up the PDF, and then this is going to give you a copy of everything that I'm talking about this evening as far as how we actually rate expression. And it's coming up. It looks like it's taking its sweet time. So you can see here. So this is something that you would be able to download to help you as you teach your classes. So I just wanted to show you that you would have access to this if you do decide to adopt our tools and bring them into the classroom. Very useful. All right, I want to bring up our, all right, so getting back to rating reliability. So we look at different categories of reliability. We look at expression, and we also look at the headlines. We look at the graphics that exist on the page that we're looking at, and how might those graphics impact perception. And we also consider the amount of effort that it takes in order to write the article. Did they have to actually get up away from their desk and go do the research? How much primary sourcing are they using to inform their article? Is this an investigative reporting piece, or are they just re-reporting things that have already been reported elsewhere? So the amount of effort is important as well. And then we look at the veracity. What is the likelihood that this is true? So these are all the categories that we look at, and I'm going to break down these categories for you so that you can see how you might address these in the classroom as well. So let's look at the category of expression. Expression, it's important for your students to learn that fact and analysis and opinions are really distinct concepts that represent different types of information or statements. And this is where they can learn the nuance that exists in reading the news and figuring out how to determine the differences between these things. So on a scale of 1 to 5, if your students read a certain passage, you can go through asking them, because a fact is a statement that can be objectively proven or verified. Go through the statements and make the determination. Does this qualify as a fact? Is it based on observable evidence? Is there data, to help support it? Is the information, is it widely accepted as true? Is the general consensus, this is something that everybody agrees on? Are these facts, are they being influenced by personal beliefs? Facts are not influenced by personal beliefs or the biases that exist. They are universally valid. So that's a discussion that you can have with your students regarding what is a fact. Also for, expression, we look at the analysis piece. For example, if I were to say the earth revolves around the sun, that's a good example of, well, that's a fact. We're not really having to, not anymore at least, examine and interpret the data to come to a conclusion that the earth, revolves around the sun. That's something that is established. That's universal knowledge. Analysis is different from that. We do have to examine the information in front of us, and that we're interpreting that information or the data in order to gain a deeper understanding, of that subject. And we're going to draw some conclusions. So again, as you take your students through the text, you can ask them, is this factual? Or maybe is this fact that is combined with some analysis? Because you can see that the text is drawing some conclusions from those facts. Does it involve breaking down complex ideas, evaluating different components of it? Is the writer making connections between the facts? And so, that analysis, it often does involve the critical thinking and the reasoning and the logical, the deductions that occur. It's something that aims to improve the insights that are gained, or it's trying to explain something based on the information that's available. So in the context of journalism, analysis can involve, examining what may have caused this to happen and what are the implications of this now that it has happened, or, what is the significance of this event that just occurred? Those are the questions, that you could ask your students in the class. It is important to note that analysis can be influenced by perspective. It can be influenced by the level of expertise the writer may have, or the level of expertise the people that the writer interviewed, what level of expertise they have. So that could influence the analysis. Again, another point of discussion, for your students. And then something else that we look at in terms of expression on a scale of 1 to 5, we work our way down to opinion. And so we know that opinion is a personal belief, right? It's a viewpoint, or it's a judgment that has been made about a particular matter. And it is subjective. It represents an individual's subjective preference or their perspective. It may be a projection of their feelings, how they feel about a certain topic. So that's why opinions can vary from person to person. Now they can be informed by knowledge, right? They can be informed by experience, but they're not necessarily something that is universally valid. So if I were to say chocolate ice cream is the best flavor of ice cream, that's going to be an example of an opinion. Now, I may have some examples. I may even have what I think is evidence to support that claim. But at the end of the day, that is going to be my opinion. So in expression, this first category that we look at in order to determine the overall reliability, it is absolutely crucial that we learn to distinguish between facts and analysis and opinions to be able to understand the nature of the information that's being presented and to critically evaluate its reliability and its objectivity. So, facts provide the foundation of the knowledge that is being presented. So this is the start of determining the reliability aspect within our methodology. So helping your students learn how to distinguish on a scale of 1 to 5. And we like the scale of 1 to 5 because it really does help simplify on that spectrum from original, high effort fact reporting all the way down to opinion, or maybe even opinions that are selective or information that's misleading. We really want them to be able to gauge first what is the type of expression that's being used in this text. So on a scale of 1 to 5. So let's dive into facts a little bit more. Typically in journalism, now I remember I started out as a journalist way back in the day, many, many, many years ago. And I remember the very first lessons that that all of us learned when we were going to write a story is to make sure in that very first paragraph, get the basic information in there. Because if the person reads at least just the first paragraph or two, they got the gist of the story. And typically what is going to be contained in the first, 1 or 2 paragraphs of that article are going to be what's typically considered to be the facts, right? These are the universal truths. This is what we understand, what is actually factually true about the event that's unfolded. And typically, what are we asking? Who did it? What happened? When did it happen? And where did it happen? Those are the determining factors on what we would consider to be facts in a news story. Very basic. How does that differ from when it goes from fact reporting to analysis? So again, these are some of the things that you can ask your students as you're helping them dissect the text that you're looking at or the episode that you're listening to with them. It goes beyond that who, what, where, and when. When it begins to go into the area of, well, what about the why? What about the how? When they start writing, including statements of meaning, when they start interpreting things, when they start to try to make inferences about the information that you're reading, when they begin to make conclusions based on all of the facts that are being presented, is the writer making a prediction about what is going to happen next? And a good fair question is this a prediction that's based on the information, or is this a prediction and they're not backing that prediction up, with facts that exist in the article? So is this a prediction or is this an assumption? Is this speculation? Those are very important questions to have, as a basis for this discussion, the differences between fact and analysis. And those questions will help lead to specific conclusions and judgments. And it'll be very apparent, in the text that does exist. Another thing that we do when, as analysts, when we are looking at the reliability and we're specifically focusing on the expression part, the expression category, is we try to look at the ratio. So if you're looking at the article itself, take it as a whole, take a macro view of that article. How much of that article is made up of factual statements versus how much of it is made up of analytical statements, analysis, how much of it is made up of opinion? And so if you can get a good idea of the ratio between those different aspects of that article, that is also going to help you determine where you might place this article on the chart as far as reliability. Now, remember, expression is not the only category that we use, but if you look at it, and this article is a good 90% factual statements, and they've only made about, 10% of the article is a conclusion based on those statements, then that's going to most likely score pretty high in reliability. That's going to be what I'm thinking right now, this is going to be pretty high. But again, expression is just one category that we're looking at. But this is giving me a good indication. If it's about half and half, then I definitely know I need to pay special attention to the other categories that we're going to go over in order to arrive at an overall assessment of how reliable I think this source is. If the vast majority of the article that you're reading is 80% why statements, it's all analysis, it's all conclusion, it's mostly judgments that are being made and very little facts to explain the conclusion that's being made, then again, that's going to help you determine where you might think this should go on the reliability scale. So again, those are questions, those are considerations. This is a fantastic discussion point to have with your students in the classroom. Something else that we can look at when we're trying to determine fact versus analysis versus opinion, sometimes the article will tell us, you look at the website, you go to that section, and it makes it very clear. This is in the opinion section. Some of them will label it, this is an analysis. Some of them will label it, this is investigative reporting. And we appreciate that. We think it makes our job easier, but the labels, we can't always take them for face value. So while it may say opinion, it may say news, it may say investigative reporting or analysis, whatever that label is, that's a good opportunity. Still read through the text and, look at expression like we just did and try to make a determination on where on the scale you think that would go as far as fact, analysis, or opinion. It may match the label that they have already, but it doesn't always match. We've looked at so many articles at Ad Fontes. We have plenty of these, plenty of occasions where this does occur. So that's something else to just keep in mind as you're looking at the expression part, scale of 1 to 5, all the way from fact to analysis to opinion. Something else to keep in mind that you can use as an analogy with your students, and this is something that we keep in mind as analysts that helps us differentiate between fact and analysis and opinion, is when we think about the courtroom and what happens in a courtroom. If it sounds like it's a witness that is just making statements, remember, who did this happen to, or who was there? When did this happen? Where did this happen? These are going to be the types of questions that are establishing fact. So on that scale of 1 to 5, the witness, whoever is explaining, making these factual statements, that's going to be at a level 1. But if we get to where it sounds like, okay, the judge is analyzing the facts, right? And then the judge has to make a conclusion based on what the judge hears, based on the facts, then that's going to be at a level 3, right? Because that is pure analysis. I'm taking in the information and now I have to make a conclusion. That's what the judge has to do. And then if we move down to the level 5, where the opinion is, this is where it's going to sound like this is a lawyer making an argument. So if you're reading through the text and it sounds like the writer is advocating for a position, or they are trying to persuade you to believe one thing or another. If it's based on a question of value, they're trying to convince you that something was right or something was wrong, something is good versus something is bad. If it's a value judgment, then that's going to bring it down into the opinion area, because that's what lawyers do. They're going to create that argument. And if it's a call to action, right? If it's a persuasive piece, and then at the very end, it makes the ask, there's this call to action, and it's asking you to take that next step now that it's tried to convince you that this is the step you need to take. These are all things that we can look for in the text in order to determine on that scale 1 through 5, fact, analysis, or opinion, where it should belong. So this is a good analogy to just remember. Is it a witness making factual statements? Is it a judge analyzing, coming to a conclusion? Or is this the lawyer trying to convince you to believe one way or the other, that this is true or this is false? They're making an argument to get you to believe them. And so that analogy I find to be quite useful in determining that scale. So that's the expression part of the expression category that we use when we're determining whether or not this is reliable. So remember, I said that that's just one category. Another category that we do look at is called veracity. Now, oftentimes in the news, you'll hear people will argue whether something is true or whether something is false. This is fake news. And even if a little bit of it is true, or most of it is true, that's where we like to get into the arguments with the news. In reality, there's a lot of gray space in there, whether something is true or something is false. And so that's where veracity comes in. In this particular category, with something is true, is it easily provable? So we're going to look at the provability and the probability of it being true. Is it widely accepted? If you're doing your lateral reading, how is this being talked about, or how is this being discussed? How is this being written about across the board doing the lateral reading? Are the statements considered to be true, and are they easily provable and widely accepted across the board? If they're not, if you can read these statements and you determine, well, these are mostly true, these are mostly provable, these are mostly accepted, then on that scale from 1 to 5, that's going to move down the reliability just a little more. If you're reading a lot of statements in the text that are neither true or false, they're debatable. Earlier, if I said chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream, right? That's my opinion. But what if I were to say chocolate is good for you? Well, I'm sure that you could find the research that would support your argument that it's not good for you, and then someone else could find the research to help support their argument that it is good for you. So is it true or is it false? Well, it is subject to debate whether or not chocolate is good for you. So that would be at a 3 right there, because it's neither true nor false. It is debatable. It's neither provable or disprovable. And then the further down we move, is it mostly false? So if you're looking at these statements and most of them are disprovable, the facts disproving are mostly accepted, then we know that's going to be at a level 4. And then moving down, the statements that are made are absolutely false, and it's easily disprovable, the facts that are being stated. And it's widely accepted that the statements that are being made are false. So that's the first part of veracity. What is the likelihood that this is true, all the way down to what is the likelihood that this is false? So how do we integrate this into our methodology? Well, there's certain steps that we look at in order to determine the likelihood of the veracity. So when we go to evaluate this part, these are some of the things that we want to make sure that we look for. One of the first things is to ask yourself, as you're reading this text, do you really have a reason to question the veracity of this statement? Do you have a reason to question the likelihood that this statement is true or this statement is false? If you see any red flags, or if there are any red flags that exist for you in that statement that will cause you to question it, then that's going to be a reason to evaluate the veracity. A lot of times what we do as analysts is we will look it up. Earlier I mentioned doing some lateral reading. If there is a claim being made in a particular text, it's a good idea to go ahead and look that up and see what are some of the other sources and what are they reporting about this topic. You can sort the types of results that you get. So if you do have your class look up different results of this particular topic that you're looking at, have them organize the results into the quality of the sources. So are these sources high quality? Are they medium quality? Or are they low quality sources? Because again, this is going to help them determine the likelihood of the veracity. If there are links within the article, we follow those links. So as analysts, when we click on a link and it goes to a different source, we are identifying the quality of that source. Sometimes if we click on a link and we notice that that link takes you back to the same source over and over again, they're not really providing any external sources to corroborate the information that they're talking about. That right there is a reason to question the veracity of that source. So weigh the relative credibility of any of the information that you're coming across. We do come across a lot of conflicting information out there. So this is an exercise in weighing the credibility of those sources and try to make your best guess at the likelihood, the probability that this is true versus the probability that this is false, based on the corroborating sources that exist and the credibility of those sources that exist. So when you put all of this together, you can have your students decide on a scale of 1 to 5, from true all the way down to false, how true or how false do you think the claim is that's being reported in that text. Some other things that we tend to look for when we want to question the veracity of a source. If it sounds like it's pretty far-fetched, if something is making a statement and it causes you to pause because it just seems that it's pretty out there, again, that red flag, then that's when we want to do the steps that we just covered. Maybe you have prior knowledge of the information and it can potentially refute the claim that's being made in the article. That's a red flag. So that's going to be another reason to question the veracity of that article. If there's something that, if this is true, wow, this is big if it is true, but you haven't heard it anywhere else yet, but this is a claim, a huge claim that is being made by this particular source, again, red flag, a good reason to question the veracity and go back to those questions that we just looked at. Another red flag that we tend to look at as analysts is if it appeals to us emotionally. We all have different triggers. We all have different topics that we care about to various degrees. And so if you find that you're reading a text and it really does appeal to you emotionally, and it could be a positive emotion, it could be a negative emotion, but if it's very heavy on that emotional appeal and you look at that text, but it's very low on that logical appeal, that's going to be a red flag. And that is cause to go back to that scale of 1 through 5, veracity, probability of true, probability of false. This really gives you a way to kind of step back from the text, especially if it appeals to you emotionally. Take a step back from that text and look at it from a more objective point of view. So let's talk about looking up the information. That's one of the things that I talked about previously. If there is a reason to question the veracity, students today are pretty savvy online, so I'm sure that they are already very familiar with Google. There are all kinds of search engines now that exist. They might be using all kinds of different search engines, and that's fine. But the important thing is to help them become comfortable. If they're reading a text and there is cause to question the veracity, then go ahead and look it up. So whether you use Google or you use some other search engine, make sure that they understand how to look things up and to look things up effectively, because you can type in any topic and in 0.1 seconds, they'll get 3.8 billion returns. And that's a lot of information to have to sift through. So if we can teach them how to look things up well, then that is going to help them get to the more quality resources that they need to in order to corroborate the information that you're looking at in the text. So one thing that you can do that you can show them is, pull up Google and then type in a description of that news article that you're looking at, and then put in plus and then in quote news. And that's going to pull up a lot of the resources that are reporting on the exact same article. And again, this is something that we use as analysts when we work together in our shifts and we're looking at these articles together. Oftentimes we have to do the lateral reading so that we can discern the probability, the likelihood that this is true or false. And so if you don't find it at first, get them comfortable with typing it in a variety of ways. Sometimes we do have to be patient so that we can find the information we need to be able to corroborate the information that's being reported. So again, this is a good exercise for the classroom to get them do some lateral reading and teach them how to do that lateral reading, how to arrive and how to get to those different resources. And then again, look at the credibility of those sources right there. So when you get your search results, we want them to look at, do you consider this high quality? And then have that conversation of what makes this a high quality source. What are the things that we are looking at that gives us the perception that this is high credibility, that this is a highly reliable source? What are those things that we're looking for? Or do we think this is a medium to low quality source? And then what are those things that we're looking for that would give us that indication regarding its credibility, the perception of its credibility? Now, if you get a text and you're looking up that information and you have done everything you can to find this topic that's being reported on, and it's only in that one source, you can't find any other sources to corroborate it one way or another, that is a huge red flag. So that in itself is a conversation about what does this make us think about this particular text? What does this mean about the probability that this is true versus the probability that this is false? Especially if we can't find it anywhere else on the internet, then that right there is a huge indication of the probability of the likelihood that it's true or false. And so when we look at high quality corroboration, again, looking at the veracity of the text, we're really relying on all of the information that exists on this particular topic that this text is reporting on. So we oftentimes will find ourselves going to different fact-checking sites. We like to visit national and local news sites that have a very good reputation. And if you're wondering about where those sites are or what those sites are, then look at the media bias chart and you can see where the high quality sources that we consider to be high quality sources located, toward the top of the chart. Familiarize yourself with those particular sources to see what they are saying about the topics that are being discussed in these sources. Wikipedia. Now, I know educators, we like to debate Wikipedia and the use of Wikipedia. I taught communication and public speaking for 18 years at the college level, and this was always a fun discussion with my students, and I'm sure that you've had this discussion with your students as well. Wikipedia is a great place to start, but it's not the place to finish, right? So, because there can be questions of whatever is in Wikipedia. So, but it is a good place to start. See what's in Wikipedia and then verify what's in Wikipedia. Sometimes we want to look at industry specific research sites. If we want to look at Investopedia, USA Facts, Statista, those different types of sites can be very useful. Pew Research, the Gallup organization, all of those research sites can be incredibly helpful when you want to corroborate some of the information that exists out there. And then we also look at some of the local, state, and government offices and agencies. If they're releasing reports about a certain topic, we want to make sure that we're familiar with those reports because that can help corroborate whatever claims that are being made in a particular source. And then look for, the primary sources. If this is an article that's talking about a legal proceeding, then, teach your students to look for the court filings. Can they find the court filings? Are there any official statements being released by the organization itself that's being talked about? What are the specific government reports that exist, and what do those reports say about this topic? Are there any studies that exist about this topic to help corroborate whatever this topic is that's being discussed in the article? And then we also look for videos and transcripts of speeches. We do know that sometimes quotes will be taken out of context to help frame the narrative a certain way. So it's oftentimes very helpful if there's a red flag, if there's cause to doubt that this is the quote that someone said, then to look for those videos and those transcripts are incredibly helpful to be able to corroborate that information. And of course, academic research sites and journals, we like to look through those, any medical research, those types of sites, anything, any high quality source to get your students used to looking up those high quality sources. I don't know about your students, but I know my students really love to find a bunch of blogs to support whatever argument they wanted to make about a particular text. And some blogs are great, but not all blogs are created equal. So to get them used to actually going to these primary, sources or high quality sources, it's a valuable tool for them to learn that there is a whole universe of information out there that they can use to corroborate the information that they're looking at. So what about the competing information? What do we do when we have competing information? Because it's a fact that you can read an article, you can read a different article, and it's going to have conflicting information. So what do? Well, we look at the credibility of the sources, and this is something that juries have to do all the time. They're going to look at competing evidence. There's going to be evidence that's conflicting, and they're going to have to be able to make their best judgment. And this is something that I think as a student is incredibly useful to be able to get comfortable with. I have to make my best judgment based on the information that I have in this moment, that my best judgment is going to be that this is high quality, this is highly reliable, that I think this is the likelihood, the probability that this is true is very high versus the probability that this is false is probably the way it's going to go. We have to get comfortable with making that judgment call, because that is the reality of a lot of the texts that we do read and a lot of the episodes that we listen to or watch today. So looking at the broad swath of information and the sources that the students have in front of them, and then the conversation of which set of information is more credible. That's going to help us determine the probability of the veracity of this. That's a really great discussion to have with the students as you're implementing this methodology with them. So some of the factors of credibility that we like to look at in order to determine whether or not this is a high quality source. Of course, we look at reputation, but that's not the only thing that we look at. There are many things that we want to look at, many factors that we want to look at when we're determining credibility. Yes, reputation of the source is one of them. We also like to look at the evidence of the information that we're looking at. Again, going to the likelihood, determining the likelihood of the source that we're looking at, and then figuring out what type of incentives might exist for this source. So getting used to thinking through all four of these factors is incredibly important to determine whether or not we think a certain source is credible. So, for example, reputation. This is the perception of how credible you consider this source to be. So if you have a lot of familiarity with this source, the reputation itself can be, what you know about the source can be a helpful factor. But sometimes we're looking at a lot of sources that we don't have a lot of familiarity with these sources. So we're going to have to rely on the information from others in order to determine that source's reputation. And a good example, like I mentioned beforehand, is looking at the media bias chart. You can pull up the media bias chart, look at the interactive media bias chart that's on our website, and look at the sources and see where they fall on our chart and compare them to all of the other sources. That would give you a good indication of the reputation of that source, which is a good starting point. If you want to determine the credibility of the source. But like I said, this is just one factor in many factors in determining the credibility. So good reputation or so-so reputation, it is going to weigh one way or the other concerning the credibility, but it's not the only factor to consider. So the second one that we look at is the evidence. So one thing that we do come across in text, a statement will be made that something is happening. This is different from something, there's a statement that, well, it didn't happen, or you can't prove that it didn't happen. An inability to disprove does not prove the statement. So that's something else that's important to have a conversation with the students as they learn to think through this methodology. So we have to differentiate from those statements. So how do we do that? What type of evidence can we look for in order to determine the level of credibility we think this source has? What type of data is being used? What are the statistics? Many different types of evidence can be used in any given text. The factual information, are they using expert testimonials to support the claim that's being made? Are they using witness accounts or peer testimonials in order to corroborate whatever is being claimed in that article? What type of or what kind of documentation is being used in order to support the claims that are being made in that document? So to go through each one and look at the types of evidence that's being used to support that claim is the second factor that we can look at in order to determine the credibility that we think this source has. And then, of course, we look at likelihood. This is that third factor that we look at to determine the credibility. And again, this is on a scale. So if we think about, the likelihood, where does this fall as far as the burden of proof? If there is a claim being made in this article, the burden of proof will be to prove that claim to be true. So if you are certain or almost certain that this is true, well, there's not going to be a really high burden of proof because the likelihood of it being true is going to be pretty high. But if it starts falling down the scale to probable, or it's more likely than not to be true, or it's possible, it's plausible, but it's still pretty far down there, then the higher the burden of proof that's going to exist in order to prove this statement to be true. So again, getting used to thinking about the likelihood, the probabilities, that's really useful in determining the credibility of that source. And then, of course, the very last thing that we look at as far as the credibility of the source is the incentives. What type of incentives would the writer have? What type of incentives would the organization have? What type of incentives would the source or anybody who's associated with this particular source? What are the incentives that exist out there that would impact the overall credibility of this? Is there money being exchanged? Do they gain to earn a lot of money? Oftentimes when we look at different websites, As analysts, we have found that there are a lot of sites that are just made for advertising sites. They put information out there with the goal of just making money, off of that information. That's a really big incentive and could be cause for questioning the credibility of that website that you're looking at, and looking at the power, the dynamics that exists in there, what type of attention stands to be gained from this particular report. And then the level of partisanship that exists as well. At this point, what I want to do is call your attention to the interactive chart. I've mentioned this a couple of times, with talking about partisanship and looking at all of the different sources that exist on the interactive media bias chart. This is the free version, and it doesn't have quite as many sources on it as the paid version, but it does have a pretty good representation of sources on here. So if you were to pull this up in your class and you could have a conversation, just what I'm pointing out right now, what could potentially be the incentives, especially if it's a source that's toward the bottom of the chart itself, what type of incentives potentially exist? There's a lot of confirmation bias that exists, especially in hyper-partisan areas of the chart. So you could lead a discussion on that. Now, if you're concerned about, okay, I'm teaching K-12, I'm in elementary school, or I'm in middle school, or I'm in a high school, what type of articles or what type of topics could I actually bring into my classroom that I can implement this methodology, that I can go through these steps and take my students through the reliability aspect, so I can talk to them about expression and likelihood and credibility and all of the things that we've talked about tonight. One of the things that we have created at Adfontes is called Topic of the Week. And this is fantastic because it's tailored to age level. So you could look through it and determine the level of appropriateness for your particular classroom, for your students. So we do have advanced topics that exist with our topics of the week. So you can see through these advanced topics, if you have a class of students that you think this would be the appropriate level for them, because some of these, because it is the news, sometimes they may contain topics that could be pretty challenging. It could be a little disturbing, or, so you might want to look at the topics and consider the appropriateness for your class if you want to do the advanced version. You can see that we have up here the Harlem Council seat. So we have a list of sources there from this week. Last week, we have a collection of articles for the advanced topic of the week about the affirmative action decision that was made by the Supreme Court last week. So you can see, you can pull it up to your class. You could have them look at all of these articles, go through the reliability methodology to determine what level of reliability that they think, where would this go on the chart for them, have that be a source of discussion. Go through each of these articles, and then you can compare it to what our analysts thought about these articles. So you can see right here where these articles fall on the chart itself. So this would be a good way to get them practicing the reliability part of the methodology, compare it to what our analysts believe, and then have that be the catalyst for or a foundation for a good discussion in the classroom. We have the first anniversary of Roe overturned. So you can see why with the advance, it's really going to be determined the level of whether or not you think this is going to be appropriate for your age group. Indictment, debt ceiling, all of these really fantastic topics that we've looked at for the advanced version. For the topic of the week, for the starter version, we have topics that aren't quite as heavy as the advanced version. So for example, Meta introduced a new social media platform called Threads. If you're not aware of that, don't worry. I wasn't aware of it either until like 2 nights ago. But hey, we're on top of things at Advantes. I found out from some of my peers that Threads is a thing. So it's pretty cool to read through all of these to learn about this. So a new social media platform, that could be a really great source of conversation with your class. And it's not as heavy as Roe versus Wade or, the affirmative action decision that was passed by the Supreme Court. So again, it's laid out the same way as the advanced version, though. You have all of these articles here that you can look at. Have your students read them, rate them on the chart, and then compare to what our analysts thought about those articles on the chart. And so those were the two things I wanted to call to your attention, because we are getting to the point where we're going to have about 15 minutes left in the webinar. So I want to pull up our slides again and leave room for some questions. That was a lot of information. It's basically like trying to, you're sipping from a fire hose. I realize you basically got a whole lot of training in a matter of an hour and 15 minutes. So the last 15 minutes, I would like to look through the Q&A and answer any questions that you have. So please make sure that you put your questions in there. Anything about the reliability aspect. Remember, the next webinar, the next session that we're going to have next week, we're going to go through the bias part of the chart, go through that particular methodology, and then we're going to get into some real concrete examples so that we can practice this with one another within the webinar. All right, I have Aaron and Beth are with me. I don't know if Aaron or Beth, are there any questions in there that we can begin fielding?
Yes. Hello, everybody. We have one here. When referring to quality sources to prove or dispute facts, I often hear that media can't be trusted and neither can the government. How does one address that line of thinking?
All right, Aaron, do you want to take that?
I was actually going to refer back to what it's like being in a shift. Mm-hmm. I think the first place to start is having a conversation, kind of teasing out why it is someone doesn't trust that source, finding out the root cause of that, because that's kind of our secret sauce to our ratings. At the beginning of Advantes, the ratings were done what we call asynchronously, where we had a left, right, and center do them alone. And we found that our scores were kind of all over the place. But when we brought the pods together to do it synchronously, we found that the discussion was where we really found that secret sauce, because we were able to share with each other what I would see as a center lean, what Jen would see as a right lean. And that's where we were able to tease out those differences and be like, oh, well, did you know this? And did you know this? And so sometimes it's a matter of discussing it with someone who you have engendered some trust with, and that will really kind of help bring it out.
That's right. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. I agree. That's actually one of the benefits of working in a shift with other analysts and having those conversations. We're not aware of our own blind spots. We don't know what we don't know. So being able to have those conversations with someone that you can trust, and they may be privy to different sources that you may not necessarily read. You just don't even know they exist. Yeah, so open yourself up to those conversations. Absolutely helpful. All right, what's another question?
Are these lessons available in the free version?
The lessons themselves are not a part of the free version. The topics of the week are. But if you want to be able to access the actual lessons themselves, they're a part of the Campus Pro subscription, and we have different levels of the subscription, and they are very, very affordable. From if you want it to be just for the classroom individually, on up to the entire campus, if you want the entire campus to be able to access the resources. But the interactive chart, there is a free version, and the topics of the week, those are free as well.
Someone is asking that they can't find the topic of the week. Where is it?
That is an excellent question. Let me take you through that. If you were to go to Ad Fontes Media, just go to the main Ad Fontes Media, and at the very top, you'll see up here the tabs. If you go under resources, you'll see right there, it's topic of the week, and just click on that, and then it'll take you to the advanced. And at the very top, you'll be able to choose between advanced and starter versions.
Okay, they found it.
Yay.
Related question, will we have access to the advanced program after these webinars? You may have sort of answered that already.
Yeah.
Yes, we will be sending out a recording to all registered participants.
Yeah. So if you know of anybody who they didn't register because they weren't able to make it, if you encourage them to go ahead and register anyway, because at least that way they will be able to get a copy of the recordings, and so they don't miss out on any of this information. Looks like we have some more Q&A coming up.
Okay, I got this one. Do your analysts read through all of these articles, or are you employing AI to look for certain language for each of the questions for reliability and bias? So we are actually in the process of developing an AI modeling system, but we will always employ humans as a part of the rating process, because there's no way that AI will ever be able to identify that nuance of hyperbole, sarcasm, all of those things that AI just can't identify. And as we've seen from articles and AI that has been written, and like plagiarism that has been happening so frequently as of late. So we will always have human analysts as part of it, but we do think we can do a significant portion of what we do with AI.
Yes.
I think
And I've got nothing to add to that. That was a good answer.
Thank you. I don't see any more unless anyone has any other questions.
No other questions popping up?
Looks good. I see it. And thank you so much. This was great.
Okay, awesome. So in the meantime, if you do have questions that come up, please feel free to send an email to info@adfontesmedia.com. We are having session 2 next week, so I hope to see everybody there, where we can go over the bias part of the methodology. I hope that you found this useful. I hope that you will begin to incorporate the media bias chart into some of your lessons, in media literacy, and have these conversations with your students. I can tell you that this experience of working at Ad Fontes and being an analyst with Ad Fontes, it has been so incredibly eye-opening for me. And it's a privilege to be able to have these conversations, these discussions with other analysts from across the political spectrum, because we don't know what we don't know. And so, it helps us improve our own critical thinking skills. So I invite you to use these in your classroom, have these discussions with your students. You will get a copy of the recording so that you can watch through it again if you want to incorporate some of the things into your class that we talked about tonight. Please, we encourage you to use everything that you learn in the classroom, because we really believe wholeheartedly that this is something that our students need in order to be able to develop the skills that they need to be productive citizens, and to look for what they need to look for as far as high quality sources. Erin?
Oh, we got one more question, and it's a good one.
Okay.
Have you gone back to some stories that have been proved wrong over time to assess credibility?
Yes. Accountability. Do you want to talk about that, Erin?
Yes. So we do have what's called an accountability shift, and anyone can submit articles, and we are working on opening this up to like the public to kind of democratize like our rating shifts, but it's not live yet. So stand by for that. But we do rate articles for corrections, partial corrections, and for articles that just weren't corrected at all, to assess exactly what you're discussing. And we'll rate the original article, the corrected article, depending on what exactly went down with the article. But yes, we do go back and rate articles that have been proved wrong.
Yeah. And that could be something that I can bring up for next week, since we're going to talk about bias and we're going to bring up some actual examples. We can bring in examples of some of these articles that have had to go through the accountability shift, and you can see overall how that impacts their scores. Erin just, she was working on a blog recently. I think it was CBS.
CBS and Daily Mail. It'll be live for next week, so we can bring that up as an example.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So thank you for asking that question. I think that'll be a great example for next week to be able to talk about that.
Yeah, and Courtney just asked, do you think that correction makes an impact on the source's credibility? It will depend on the source's sample size. So yes, it will, but so the more popular source, the larger the sample we have. So it will, but it's a very small impact. And if it's a smaller source, then it can have a greater impact, in which case we do try to counter for that, because we don't want to overcorrect if there just happened to be a smaller news outlet for that. So it's a little bit of sample size issue there, but we can talk more about that next time when we give the example.
Yeah, that'll be a great discussion to have. Great question. Any other questions popping up? I know how it is once we get going, and then you'll think of a question.
Exactly. I mean, we could talk about this all day. We do talk about this all day.
We are news nerds. We can talk about it all night if y'all want to.
100%.
All right. Going once? Going twice? No more questions. All right. Thank you again for joining us for day one of this webinar. I hope to see everybody again next week. Invite your teacher friends to join us next week. We're more than happy to have them. And again, contact us at info@adfontesmedia.com if you have any questions in the meantime, and we can incorporate them into next week's webinar. All right. So if you don't have anything else, we're good to go. You all have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.